For me, Mass Effect Legendary Edition is one of the easiest games in the world to like. It's also, I think, one of the easiest games in the world to misunderstand. Because oftentimes I find when people talk about Mass Effect Legendary Edition, they usually talk about it like it's just a remaster. You know, better lighting, sharper textures, smoother performance, a cleaner way to replay an old classic. And yes, all that's true. But for me, that's not really the question. The real question is whether this package still works as a game you should buy and play now, here, today, in the future. Not in 2007, not through some nostalgia, not through memory. I mean, right now, for you and me, here, now. My name is Vadd, and that is the question that we are answering here, because Legendary Edition is not selling you one game, it is selling you a full science fiction trilogy, tens of hours of story, a whole cast of people that are still talked about years later, and a mountain of DLC, and the promise that your choices will carry across all three games. And that is a huge promise. I want to stay here right at the front. After going through and completing the entire package, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. Mass Effect Legendary Edition is still absolutely worth playing. I think the real reason it's worth playing is not because it feels modern. It often does not. It's worth playing because it builds a long-form journey, and very, very few games do it like this. Very few games make your party matter. Very few games make the act of carrying a character from one game to the next feel this meaningful. I want to be very clear here. The first game is still clunky. Yes, the shooting improves over time, but it doesn't suddenly become a modern action adventure. The vehicle sections are still sometimes rough, the menus are a little cleaner, but the age never really disappears. And ultimately, even when the trilogy is at its best, there are real gaps between what it promises and what each game focuses on, and what kind of player is actually going to love it. Here in my review, the real question I'm trying to answer is whether this version still earns your time and money now, and whether the package is strong enough to carry its age, and I think up front here, for most people it is. Hey, if this review is making sense so far, liking the video generally helps me out. Thanks. I'm reviewing Mass Effect Legendary Edition as one package, as a singular product, because that's how it was sold, and that's how I think most people are going to approach it today. Yes, it is 3 individual single-player RPGs plus all the expansions and DLCs. It's one character, one long arc, one big question still hangs over the whole thing. Does the trilogy still hold up when you play it back to back to back, when you play through all 3 games? To be clear here, I'm not judging this package like a history lesson. This is being judged on its product in today's market, and if you should still spend money on it. At its simplest here, Mass Effect Legendary Edition is a story-first science fiction action RPG trilogy. A lot of words there, but stay with me here. You're going to be Commander Shepard, you'll build your version of that character, and you can carry that character through all 3 games. You're going to be able to recruit squad mates and carry some of those squad mates through all the games. You're going to make choices in missions and conversations and in larger political conflicts. You'll be fighting in real time with guns, powers, cover, and some party abilities. And the series is going to continue to ask kind of the same basic question in different forms. What kind of leader are you, and what does leadership cost over time? This is not a pure shooter, it's not a pure RPG, it's not a sandbox, it's not an open world. This is a cinematic, party-based science fiction RPG, where the real hook is not really the combat, the loot, or the exploration. I think the real hook here is the continuity. That feeling that your Shepard carries weight from game to game. That feeling that these relationships, these conversations are growing. That feeling that your choices are not just isolated dialogue options, but part of a longer personal version of the story, of the journey, and I think that's a strong pitch. Ultimately, Mass Effect Legendary Edition, I think, promises a polished way to experience one of gaming's most iconic trilogies, and in broad terms, I think it delivers. If you read too much into the word remaster, if you go in expecting these games to feel fully rebuilt for a modern audience, there's a huge gap there. There's a disconnect. This package seems to promise 3 old games made smooth enough that the age mostly disappears. But I think what it actually delivers is something more specific. It's not heavily improving older games. It's really just keeping the momentum together more than solving raw mechanics. It's a good trilogy experience that continues to live or die on its writing, party dynamic, and world building. Because I think the strongest part of the Legendary Edition is not the remaster work itself. I think the strongest part is that it preserves one of the best long-form, character-driven science fiction stories in video games, and it makes it so easy to play in one run. I don't want to downplay things. Yes, the remaster improves things. It absolutely helps. If you played the originals and you play the remaster, it is shocking how much better things are, but it's still an older RPG. It's got stiff movements, awkward pacing in spots, stretches of exploration that feel more interesting in concept than in practice. It is not built for a modern audience. But I don't think Mass Effect Legendary Edition is great because it modernizes things. I think it's great because the parts that matter the most were already strong, and the remaster does just enough to stop the older design from getting completely in the way quite as often. If you like old school world building, genuine dialogue, and just a feeling of stepping into a universe that takes itself seriously, I think the opening in Mass Effect 1 is incredibly strong. It has scale, mystery, tension, the world feels big before you understand all the details, it knows how to make the setting feel important. But if you come here for gameplay first, not the narrative, not the world building, these early hours can be rough. In the remaster, yes, the shooting has been improved, but it still has this half RPG, half third-person shooter awkwardness where the systems make sense before the feel of it does. You can tell what the game's trying to do, but it's just clunky. You can also tell it comes from a different time in game design. I think this is important to note because I think players oftentimes bounce off right here at the start. To be clear, as you move through the trilogy, Mass Effect 2, the combat sharpens, it's tighter, and it gives a much stronger rhythm. Mass Effect 3 continues to improve the gameplay of the combat system. The trilogy really does change over time between games, and it's noticeable. On some level, you might say that the first game sells the universe, the second game tries to sell the crew, and the third game sells the consequences. And on some level, I think that's why the package works. If all three games felt like the first Mass Effect game mechanically, this would be much harder to recommend. Or if all three games had the cleaner action that came later on, I think it would also lose something from its development. Yes, Mass Effect 1 has some of the roughest play, but it is the foundation of the journey. Mass Effect 2 narrows that RPG side and really gives the player center stage. And then as you get into Mass Effect 3, there's this momentum, this emotional payoff, even when not every story decision lands the way you want. And that arc between the three games in the trilogy is the product. And when you play Mass Effect Legendary Edition as one run, that arc matters more than one isolated complaint or frustration about early gunplay in the first entry. Facts are, I don't think the gameplay is good enough to support the trilogy. And that might sound like a huge negative, but I don't think the gameplay needs to be genre defining for this to work. It just needs to be there to keep the player engaged while the larger structure does the heavy lifting. As again, the combat is so weak in that first game. There's this early era stiffness where you move between cover, it just doesn't feel smooth. Movement feels kind of sticky, and the fight design is usually functional instead of exciting. And again, I think that would be a much bigger problem if the game expected combat to carry the experience. It does not. I think Mass Effect here leans on atmosphere, world building, squad conversations, in this overarching sense that you're assembling information about a larger threat. And that's why I think the rough mechanics are survivable here, especially as you move into the second game, where the moment-to-moment gameplay becomes much stronger. Fights are more immediate. The powers and weapons you're using are going to feel more integrated. The encounters have more rhythm, and the act of quite literally moving through the levels and clearing spaces just have some more energy to it. And then as you continue through the trilogy, the third game pushes that even further, all the while not downplaying the atmosphere, world building, or conversations you have along the way. At its best, at the absolute peak of it could be, Mass Effect is not really about mechanical mastery. It's about momentum, control, and kind of the class identity, using the powers you develop in a way that makes your battlefield feel manageable. And I think it's enough, and it works. But I think it also means if you come here expecting extremely deep combat systems, you're going to be disappointed. For me, I found the missions a little bit of a hit or miss. Some of the weaker ones, I started to really feel the structure more so than the drama. Go here, clear this, check that, return. Some of the stronger missions were tied to stakes, characters, and hard choices. Sometimes you have a companion with a loyalty mission, and it just works because it tells you something more about your squad mate and often changes how you see them. The main story missions consistently reframed new threats, shifted political pictures, and just forced me to commit to a direction that was going to change the course of history, and they really landed. At the same time, there's a difference between scale and meaningful discovery. I don't think exploration was the best experience. I don't think the balance is quite there. Sometimes you're exploring because the game is giving you something interesting to find, and sometimes you feel like you're exploring because Mass Effect thinks driving over rough terrain to create an adventure is fun, and it's not. Again, I think this trilogy of titles works best when it stops trying to be bigger than it needs to be and focuses on the character, consequences, and those main story authored missions. I think whenever it chases a version of skill or open worldness or exploration, it starts to feel a little thin. This is not a loot first game. This is not the kind of experience where the main reason you keep playing is the promise of endless build experimentation or some huge endgame system. I think the players that are going to really enjoy this are going to find their motivation coming from wanting to see what happens next, wanting to keep your crew alive, wanting to see how your Shepard changes across the journey. There is a very real progression system here. Classes, their powers, their upgrades, there's weapon, armor choices, morality paths, squad setups, important decisions, and all these things matter because they're there to shape your version of the story, but not because the game is obsessed with the endless mechanical variations. I think Mass Effect does a good job of making you feel the identity of your build, but it doesn't really drown you in clutter. And that's because this is a game you play because of the combination of build, morality choices, squad bonds, mission outcomes, and those carried over decisions that run with you throughout the journey. I think this is why it has a strong replayability. Not because every one run becomes completely different, but because small changes can reshape the tone, the relationships, and the emotional texture of your journey. And I think that's enough that people will come back to this one for years and years later on. Because ultimately, the story and presentation are where Mass Effect really wins. Even if you want to argue about individual plot points, specific character arcs, or this ending or that ending, the way the game handles this faction or that faction, the trilogy still does something that a lot of RPGs talk about and almost none of them pull off. It makes the whole journey feel like one life. Characters come back, small conversations matter later, your past choices carry emotional weight, even when the practical gameplay is limited. The crew doesn't feel like a roster, they feel like people you spend time with. Mass Effect is stronger because it shows accumulation. It's trust built over time, regret built over time, loyalty built over time. I think that feeling that this whole thing has a history is part of why the trilogy continues to stand to this day. The world building, I think, also holds up well as it's delivered with confidence. The universe feels like it existed before John Shepard walked into it, and there are politics, species tension, institutions, myths, rules, and grudges all in motion. I think that gives the setting weight very early. And as a presentation, the remaster makes the trilogy easier on the eyes. And I think that matters more in the first game than anywhere else. The facing, the lighting, the environments, the overall clarity of benefits. But the real strength, I think, remains the mood. Space stations, ships, ruined world, combat arenas, briefing rooms, quiet crew conversations. They all have a strong sense of place. And there's solid voice acting throughout the trilogy. I don't think everything's perfect or everything's terrible. Even when the voice lines are more functional than elegant, I think the entire cast gives commitment to their roles. I think they make the quiet scenes land. And for a trilogy here that's built so heavily on crew loyalty, the tension of politics and personal choices, I think that commitment to the performance matters a lot. If nothing else, I think the biggest strength here is how good the continuity feels. You can import your Shepard forward from game to game to game. I don't think it's just a feature. I think it is the heart of this package. I think it's what turns Legendary Edition from a bundle into a journey. On top of that, I think another major strength is the crew. Not every squad mate will work equally well for every player, but I think the overall standard of selection is high enough and the group dynamic is engaging enough that recruitment matters, loyalty matters, checking in with people matters, and it's not a small thing. And the party members aren't just a nice extra here, they are the spine. And I also want to give credit here that the Mass Effect trilogy here knows when scale should feel personal. There's galaxy level stakes. There's historical moments in the making. There are, planetary wars going on, species going extinct, and sometimes the best moments in the journey are smaller. A quiet conversation, a mission outcome, a decision that says more about Shepard than about the larger war itself. And I think that balance is hard to get right, and I think they mostly nailed it. There's good pacing across the full package. Not in every hour, not in every mission, but in the overall structure. This trilogy really keeps giving good reasons to continue. There's this pull forward with new reveals, a new recruit, a new mission consequence, a callback to an earlier choice, and another step forward in payoff. There's this real pull that kind of moves you through the experience. But I think the biggest weakness here remains is that the remaster does not erase the age. It kind of manages the age. Because whether you love this package or merely respect it will depend a lot on how patient you are with an older design. Mass Effect 1 feels old in moment-to-moment gameplay. Yes, the remaster here and these improvements matter, but I don't think they fully solved the stiffness, some of the awkward mission pacing, uneven exploration, and systems that sometimes create friction instead of excitement. I think there's also some inconsistency in what the trilogy wants to prioritize. One game feels like it leans harder into that RPG structure, while another feels more heavily streamlined and focused on character missions, while another pushes urgency in wartime moments. Yes, the variety keeps the trilogy fresh, but it can also make the package feel less unified. I think it's part of the reason why some players will say they love one game and merely tolerate some of the others. I think another big weakness here is that all these good, important, valuable choice and consequence moments that really are part of the magic of the series are often stronger emotionally more so than mechanically. I think the trilogy does a very good job of making choices feel important. There's a real weight behind them emotionally. But I don't think they always have an equally strong leaning towards the radical difference this creates. I don't think it's a fatal flaw, but I think it's something worth noting. I think something else that in retrospect stands out more is there's a cinematic style to things that sometimes hides how straightforward your actual inputs and interactions are. Sometimes you are genuinely making huge earth-shattering, galaxy-spanning changing decisions, and sometimes you're mostly moving through kind of an authward scheduled sequence, and you're really just being carried by the writing and presentation more than your interaction or deep system interplay. I think that's fine if you want a story-first RPG, but I think it's less fine if you're interested in a systems-first RPG. In a perfect world, I wish the Mass Effect Legendary Edition had been a little bolder with the first game. Specifically, I wish they'd been a little more aggressive, modernizing things mechanically. Just better cover feel, better exploration, less dead space, more meaningful exploration, some stronger encounter design, and a little cleaner relationship between the RPG stat page and how it feels to use those stats when you shoot your upgraded weapon or use your new powers. I think that alone would make the whole trilogy so much easier to recommend without any disclaimers. I think also I would have liked to have seen a smoother transition between games. I don't mean that it was hard to import my character, but I wanted a stronger sense of mechanical continuity. Right now, the trilogy works emotionally as one story, but mechanically, it's kind of an evolving game series. And there's a ceiling there that just doesn't quite get hit. I think the best version of this would have preserved the identity of each entry while making things feel less like 3 excellent stages in a developer's history and more like one truly seamless trilogy. But that's in a perfect world, and maybe that's setting the bar a little too high. We talk about value for money. As a full-price remaster, I think there's obvious hesitation, especially when this is a pretty conservative remaster. You're not really getting 3 games that have been rebuilt from the ground up. You're getting 3 games that have been cleaned up, improved, and better preserved. Still, I think the amount of content here is hard to ignore. You're getting a full trilogy. You're getting the major single-player DLCs, and you're getting one of the most replayed, noted science fiction RPGs series ever made in a single package that is so easy to progress your character between game to game to game. You're getting density, not just hours here, and hours that actually build on each other, and I think that matters more than just raw length. If you're a brand new player, I think the value is very good here. Even at a higher price, I think there's enough here that the package makes it easy to justify if story-driven RPGs are already your thing. I think for returning players, the value depends much more on what you want. If you want the best, clean way to replay the trilogy, this is exactly that. If you're really hoping for something closer to a full-on remake, I think the value here gets a little more debatable because the improvements may feel respectful more so than transformative. On some level, if you were to find this on a sale, I think the conversation's almost unfair, as at a discounted price, I think Mass Effect Legendary Edition is one of the safest story-first science fiction RPG recommendations possible. So on some level, we could summarize my buying advice like this. For newcomers, yes, this is worth buying. For return fans, yes, if this is what you want in a polished replay. But for anyone expecting a radical reinvention, I think you need to lower your expectations before you spend full price. Because ultimately, this game is for players who care about characters first. It's for players who like squad-based RPGs where conversations, loyalty, and long-term payoff matter just as much, if not more, than combat. It's for those players who want a story that builds over time instead of resetting every few hours. If you're the type of player who enjoys carrying your choices forward, even when not every branch explodes into a wildly different game, you're gonna have fun here. If you really like long science fiction journeys with a clear arc, not a sandbox, not endless procedural busywork, but a real beginning, middle, and end, you're gonna have a good time here. If you can tolerate some older design in exchange for some strong world building, memorable crew dynamics, and a sense of scale, it holds up. Mass Effect Legendary Edition is not for you if you need the first few hours to feel instantly modern. It's not for you if you're impatient with older RPG design. It's not for you if you want deep systems more so than deep writing. If you're the type of player who wants open world freedom, you're not going to get that here. If you're judging this by its loot depth, build complexity, reactive systemic simulations, and just RPG mechanical depth, it's just not for you. And I also think it's probably not for people who only care about polish, because even at its best, I think the Legendary Edition here wins through accumulation more than perfection. Mass Effect Legendary Edition still works because it understands what people loved about the series in the first place. It was never the shooting by itself. It was never the morality wheel by itself. It was never just the science fiction lore by itself. It was this combination of everything, that sense that you were building a version of your Shepard across years, across relationships, across decisions, across victories and losses, and you carry that identity from one game to the next. And Legendary Edition is good enough as a remaster that the core of the trilogy can breathe again without all the numerous old technical and quality of life barriers getting in the way. It still does not fix everything. My biggest warning label remains on that first entry, Mass Effect 1. as ultimately the remaster is more respectful than ambitious. The mechanics across this trilogy are uneven, and some of the Legendary Edition reputation comes from what this series means historically more than what it means minute to minute while you're playing it. But I don't think any of this ultimately changes my opening conclusion. Mass Effect is still one of the strongest, long-form, story-driven RPG packages you can buy. All these years later, very few games match the feeling of taking one character through an entire trilogy and having it feel like an actual journey instead of just a save file. I think it is worth playing. I think it is worth buying. Mass Effect Legendary Edition at the time of review is awarded a 4 out of 5. I recommend.